Denis Davidov, a bold Russian warrior and guerrilla leader, played a key role in resisting Napoleon, transforming Russia's military tactics. His memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, recounts his daring raids and battlefield triumphs, reviving the legacy of a forgotten hero. These are his words. Let's begin. On 3rd October, we marched out and came to the village of Pokrovskoe. On the 4th, I made a general reconnaissance probe and divided our party into 3 sections, so that each contained a portion of Popov's regiment. 200 of these and various Cossacks of my old command, under Popov's leadership, were assigned to the woods alongside the river Vyazma, between the highway and the village of Luzhensoy. I was there with them. The 1st Bug Regiment and 100 men from Popov's outfit, under Company Commander Chechensky, crossed the highway to the villages of Stepankovo and Vopka. Another 200 men from Popov's regiment, together with the Akhturka Hussars, under Major Krapovitsky, headed for Semly, but the infantry remained in Pokrovskoe. 2 hours before daybreak, all detachments were on the move. The first body of men halted in the woods, a few yards from the bridge over the river Vyazma. 2 Cossacks climbed trees to serve as observers. Hardly an hour had gone by when they gave a whistled signal, having spotted an officer walking on foot with a musket and a dog. 10 men jumped on horseback to intercept him, surrounded him, and brought him back. This was Regimental Commander Gutels from the 4th Illyrian Regiment, a keen hunter who loved to track and shoot, and had gotten ahead of his battalion, which was probably headed for Smolensk for refitting. He had a small dog with him and a bag containing a grouse he had killed. The colonel's despair, far from exciting sympathy, simply made us laugh. After we questioned him about everything that we needed to know, he wandered off and paced up and down in deep thought. But each time he noticed his dog lying on a Cossack's coat, he assumed the stance of the famous actor Talma in the play Oedipus and exclaimed aloud, "Fatal passion." He went on repeating these words whenever his eyes rested on his musket, now in Cossack hands, or the grouse that we had hung from a lance as a reminder of his misadventure, and continued pacing back and forth. At this point, we caught sight of his battalion. We got ready, and when it came within range, the whole party pounced on it. The 1st Cossacks, in loose formation, and the reserve, in a column with 6 horses abreast, attacked. Resistance did not last long. Most of the soldiers on foot threw down their weapons, but many, taking advantage of the nearby woods, scattered and saved themselves by fleeing. We captured 2 officers and 200 men of lower rank. At the same time, Company Commander Chechensky came upon a wagon train with provisions, which was passing at night in the woods on the way from Vopka to Vyazma. When the enemy spotted our Cossacks, they tried to form the carriages into a semicircle and put up a defense. But Chechensky did not give them the time to carry out this move and captured the transport. Then the escort of infantry headed for the center of the wood and kept up a heavy fire. Chechensky, expecting his men to rout the enemy, pursued them and charged them with fixed bayonets. This brave action cost him dearly, for he bled out, and we lost 15 of the best Bug Regiment Cossacks, most badly wounded or dead. Meanwhile, Major Krapovitsky reached the highway and proceeded towards Semly. He ordered the Akhturka Hussars to advance, with sabers to their lances, and the Cossacks to hide behind them with bayonets at the ready. Thus disposed, the force resembled detachments of the Polish cavalry associated with the main enemy forces advancing on Smolensk. He did not meet anyone for some time, but when he spotted a patrol, he allowed it to pass, waiting for the main enemy force to believe itself safe from any tension, assuming his forces to be a Polish unit. Our troops waited for the enemy to come within a pistol shot range before throwing their lances and yelling, "Hurrah!" The attack threw the enemy into confusion. The lead enemy unit, consisting of a handful of men, continued to resist, but the rest took flight. This transport carried new uniforms and footwear for the whole Illyrian, Westphalian, and Neapolitan regiment, according to what we had been told in Tailing. Not far from Tailing, as Major Krapovitsky rode at full gallop towards Pokrovskoe, he was attacked by a strong band of plunderers. He did not flinch, but, drawing his saber, cut through his assailants, but not before sustaining a severe wound. His orderly picked him up, and when he reached the high ground in Pokrovskoe, he joined up with detachments of Popov's 13th Regiment, who immediately took him to a doctor. The officers in the complex raid, Popov's regiment, provided the equal of the troops that completed the encirclement. The regiment's best officers, indeed, counted among them men such as Belsky and Ropov, who had each engaged in crucial combat actions, and even His Highness Alexander himself had known of their names. The battalion regions of 406 men and 4 officers and 4 second carriages belonged to those who had fought in Chechensky's charge. The horses belonging to the escorting soldiers were distributed among Cossacks who had lost their mounts, as well as among the neighboring villagers. On that same day, I dispatched a courier to the main headquarters. I described the last raid to the general on duty and requested promotions for all who had distinguished themselves, as well as for Stepan Krapovitsky from Ukhnov, thanks to whom we had suffered no shortage of supplies, and who had arranged for the wounded to be cared for. From historical events, I must now turn once more to the heart. When Lieutenant Tyling came to see me, he said that the Cossacks had taken his watch and money. Knowing the customs of war, he was not complaining, but he begged that they would return them to his sweetheart's ring. Heaven knows, ladies, how essential it was to the feelings that raged in Mr. Tyling's soul. I had never kept my own of the heart through every campaign I experienced, quite independently of the military events. Strange to admit, but love and war had aligned in my career. So, that evening, as I checked the chronology of my life by equating stretches of military service with simultaneous love affairs that stood out like milestones in the wasteland of my youth. At that particular time, I was consumed with passion for a lady whom I believed to be true to me, but was not. The sentiments of my prisoner now readily crossed into my heart. I promised to try to satisfy his wish. Among our men returning to Ukhnov were those who had captured his ring, and I was lucky enough to find not only the ring but also a portrait, a lock of hair, and letters that belonged to him. I immediately forwarded them to Tyling with this note on the back. "Receive, sir, the effects which are so dear to you. May they help to remove your sorrow and serve as proof that courage and adversity are respected in Russia as everywhere else. Denis Davidov, partisan." Tyling apparently lived in Otlov until 1814, where he often recalled this incident gratefully, telling people about it with warm appreciation and speaking of my generosity to his sweetheart. I later learned that she had married one of the objects of his affection, as it had done with each campaign, and changed the course of the war. It is hard to know whether he was happy, but he continued the life of a hussar for a steadfast existence, exchanging fantasy for reality. On 5th October, our unit went to Andreyani. There, I discovered that the enemy detachment had split into 2. One part was to be found in a small village towards Krutoy, the other in Lozmin, near Vyazma. We immediately made for Krutoy. One body of troops, numbering 100 men, with Ensign Biryukov, was dispatched to Beleschino. It was instructed to remain concealed nearby and to send out groups to the right and to the left in order to screen my planned attack on the enemy positioned near Krutoy. Our whole party made for that village, veering to the left so as to keep communications open with Biryukov and, if successful, to push the enemy in the opposite direction from where the other part of their detachment was located. Because we were uncertain as to the real distance between Krutoy and Andreyani, instead of arriving 2 hours before nightfall, we got there after dark. We had to decide whether to postpone the attack until morning or to undertake a night foray, which is always uncertain and often fatal to the attackers. Any army group depends upon the cooperation of its constituent parts. And what cooperation can there be when nobody can see anything? What's more, very few people give their best when there are no spectators around. That goes for soldiers too. Even Ajax insisted on daylight for a battle. I knew this to be true, but I also realized the inconvenience of postponing the fight until morning, when the neighing of a horse, the barking of a dog, or the honking of a goose could interfere with the success of the operation. Therefore, with trust in God, we launched our night attack. An autumn drizzle had been falling all day, and the darkness was total. We struck with our reserve regiment and some infantry. Fortunately, the enemy guards were fast asleep in their huts and refused to wake up. In the meantime, Krapovitsky's and Chechensky's men galloped into the village. Some of them dismounted and, shouting "Hoorah!" started to fire at the windows. Reinforcing them with 100 infantrymen and taking 200 Cossacks from the reserve, I led them across the Uda stream to prevent the enemy from sneaking into Vyazma by the side roads. But the night was so black that we lost our way, and our guide brought us out at a different spot from the usual crossing. This forced us to descend by fits and starts from a considerable height and get across as best we could. Not knowing the surroundings, I decided to go slowly and keep firing away with pistols and shouting, "Hurrah!" Fortunately, the enemy chose not to come this way, but turned towards Kikino and fled in disorder along the road from Ukhnov to Gzhatsk. Our whole party chased them for about 4 versts. Then I detached 100 Cossacks to pursue the fleeing French, but to bear left so as to keep closer to our group and stay in touch with the road between Vyazma and Zarevo, where I intended to turn up after our sweep on Losmino. In this operation, we took prisoner 1 platoon leader, 1 officer, and 376 foot soldiers. And because it was night, I directed my men not to get involved in taking a lot of prisoners. We captured as many of the enemy as we killed. After tying them up and sending them to Ukhnov, as was customary, I let the horses enjoy a well-deserved rest. Then, dispatching the infantry to Ermaki, we set off for Losmino. I had to go by way of Belischino in order to join up with Bertukov and to replace his unit with the 100 Cossacks who had been sent to pursue the enemy. Also, I needed to gather information from him about the enemy located in Losmino. And lastly, by turning towards Derevestchin and Krasnoya Gora, we planned to arrive from the Vyazma side in the rear of the enemy and fall on them like snow out of the blue. All my plans would have been fulfilled to the letter if only enemy foragers had not sighted my party and hurried on to Losmino to warn their commander of my coming. My riders chased this rebel, but because we had been on the march for the preceding 24 hours, including 2 hours of fighting, the horses had become weary, thus allowing some of the foragers to get away and spread the alarm through the detachment, which was clearly doomed. Meanwhile, we continued to advance at full trot along the road from Vyazma to Losmino. It was getting light, and because of the incessant rain, the road had become quite slippery. My opposite number had been careless, and had omitted to shoe all his horses, so that about half of them were not properly provided. Nevertheless, upon my arrival at Losmino, he met us on firm footing. As the fighting got underway, the forward elements came to grips, and the action teetered back and forth inconclusively. When our whole force was battle-ready, we charged the 3 lines of the enemy, positioned one behind the other. At the first clash, the enemy front line tumbled back into the second, and the second collided with the third. Then they all fled headlong. You had to have been a witness to this event to believe the confusion that reigned among the French ranks. To make matters worse, half of the detachment came crashing upside down. The horses that had not been properly shod collapsed as if struck by grape shot. Their riders ran off on foot in every direction without resistance. 2 squadrons did form in battle order and attempted to move forward and impede our attack. But when they sighted my hussars at the forefront of my reserve, they immediately turned back for good. The pursuit continued until noon. We cut, slashed, shot, and dragged into captivity officers, soldiers, and horses. In a word, the victory was complete. I was overflowing with joy. We came to a halt. There were 403 men and 2 officers taken, all wounded. The regimental commander, I was told, had fallen on the field of battle, and with him another 150 rank-and-file men. The others scattered through fields and woods, or were captured by the inhabitants. In all these engagements, we lost only 4 Cossacks, and 15 others were wounded together with 2 hussars. Up to 50 horses had also been killed or wounded. It goes without saying that I was impatient to boast to the field marshal about this, my finest success to date. A courier was immediately dispatched with a report still smoking from the fire of the battlefield. I was utterly confident that this double victory would be received with praise from all quarters. In the meantime, new plans, new alarms, and new engagements overshadowed the past. I did not inquire from headquarters about this matter, assuming that it could not get lost in all the shuffle, and that the only reason they were keeping quiet was that they were too busy. I received no reply because I did not follow things up, and this mutual silence continued until the winter of 1813. Only then did everything become clear. I learned that my courier had been seized by scavengers on the way to Ukhnov and had perished along with my report. Through a piece of good luck, this exploit, which I may say without bragging was marked by superior planning and implementation, remained known only to my party, the enemy governor of Vyazma, and the remnants of the French forces which survived the engagement. I am pretty sure that it was even concealed from Napoleon himself, because they feared his anger if he heard that Cossacks had been used for totally different purposes than those for which they were intended. That is what fate has in store for individual commanders, whereas at the level of the three services, strict accounting for every little thing. It happened that several similar fates sank into oblivion, but for different reasons. On the day and the following 2 days, my reconnaissance squads were patrolling along the highway between Vyazma and Fedorovka and succeeded in intercepting the course of the convoys. By the 8th, my group came up with the rear of the enemy, with about 100 Cossacks who had been sent in pursuit of the enemy in the neighborhood of Krutoy. At the same time, Moscow awoke from its lengthy slumber when Moscow and now towards Fominskoye. Napoleon's intentions now became very clear. He intended to leave the Tarutin region, to execute all his Maloyaroslavets, and then, retaking Kaluga before the Russians, to pass on to Smolensk via Smolensk by way of Medin and Yukhnov. A real battle had been waged at Maloyaroslavets on the 6th of November, and at midnight on the 8th he moved out. Only at 9 a.m., on the 9th, Napoleon ordered the army to proceed towards Yukhnov. Prince Eugene, who had been delayed by Dokhturov at the river crossing, continued his approach. The emperor, on the other hand, was proceeding north. Meanwhile, General Dorokhov, occupying with one detachment the vital positions of Medin, cut off the road leading from Moscow to Fominskoye and to the attack of the vicinity of Talo. Eugene Beauharnais' detachment was able to reinforce, as well as move on to Smolensk, and we expected them at Medin at 3 p.m. on the 8th. Prince Eugene, who was delayed by Dokhturov at the stream crossing, continued his approach. The emperor, on the other hand, was proceeding north. In his notes on the War of 1812, Davidov asserts that if Napoleon's stay at Vyazma had been cut short by 2 weeks, none of Kutuzov's plans would have come to fruition, and the French army could have reached Smolensk in fair weather and largely overlooked. Meanwhile, on the right, Chief of the General Staff of the First Army, Ermolov, gave orders to the partisan leaders Figner and Seslavin to proceed in the direction of Fominskoye in order to gather information about the enemy. Figner failed to get across the river Luzha, heavily guarded by enemy outposts. Seslavin managed to skirt this river and approach the Borovsk road. There, leaving his party behind, he managed to go through the woods to the road itself. There he saw enemy outposts in line of defense moving one another to Borovsk. He even spotted Napoleon himself surrounded by his marshals and imperial guard. Daringly, Seslavin managed to sneak in, scooped Lieutenant from the ranks of the old guard, tied him up, swung him over his saddle, and quickly headed back to Dokhturov's corps. In the meantime, both Dokhturov and Ermolov, not suspecting that Napoleon had left Moscow, were heading for Aristov and Fominskoye. Persistent autumn rain had ruined the road surface, and the great quantity of artillery that was accompanying the corps was slowing down its progress. Ermolov suggested to Dokhturov to leave the artillery here, within 15 miles of Aristov. From there, it was not far from Tarutino and Maloyaroslavets. It could easily reach the latter destination, where its presence would be needed, and for now, the exhausted horses could get some rest. Dokhturov readily agreed, and his corps reached Aristov towards evening, settling in the village for the night, while Ermolov, together with other generals, remained in bivouacs. It was already midnight, and in a few hours the whole corps was supposed to march out to Fominskoye, according to Kutuzov's orders. Suddenly a horse was heard arriving at full gallop, and Seslavin was shouting, "Where is Alexei Petrovich?" Appearing before Ermolov and accompanied by his prisoner, Seslavin gave details to the general of everything he had seen. The prisoner too confirmed that Napoleon had left Moscow with his whole army and was now a very short distance from the corps location. Ermolov considered this news so vital that he had all the troops awakened and armed and personally went to see Dokhturov. This brave but not very perceptive general, once appraised of the situation, found himself in a quandary. He did not dare continue the advance toward Fominsko, but feared that by marching away from Aristov, he would incur Kutuzov's wrath for not following his assignment. At this decisive moment, Ermolov, as on many other important occasions, turned out to be the guardian angel of the Russian army. His eagle eye had summed up the entire situation, and in the name of the commander-in-chief and in his capacity as chief of the general staff, he ordered Doktorov to retrieve the artillery temporarily left behind and to make haste towards Maloyaroslavets. Assuming complete responsibility for not carrying out Kutuzov's orders, he dispatched Staff Officer Bolkovsky, who was to explain personally to the field marshal the reasons that prompted him to change the direction the troops were now taking. Ermolov urged them to hurry to Maloyaroslavets with the entire army. Ermolov himself, with the 1st Cavalry Corps and the cavalry regiment of Colonel Nikitin, proceeded towards the village of Kotovo, where General Dorokov's detachment was deployed, wishing to ascertain in person whether Seslavin's information was well-founded. Learning of an exchange of fire that Dorokov had initiated with enemy observation posts, he sent him word and asked for it to be stopped immediately. Dorokov protested, saying, "If Alexei Petrovich were here in person, he would act exactly as I am." But Dorokov soon ran into strong enemy reserves. Ermolov saw this, and fearing he might be defeated by a stronger enemy, moved forward Nikitin's cavalry. Confirming his earlier order to Dorokov, he proceeded through a small forest and reached a wide clearing that extended from Borovsk to Maloyaroslavets. There, he sighted a large encampment of the Italian army and learned from prisoners that Napoleon was expected to dine in Borovsk that very day. Ermolov promptly ordered a brave officer of the Cossack regiment, Sistev, to take the shortest route to Maloyaroslavets, even if he came dangerously close to the enemy, enter the town, and collect all possible information concerning the place and the enemy. Sizdev soon reported back to Ermolov that 3 Italian battalions were already there, but were being held up because the inhabitants had dismantled the bridge. The local officials had by now left the town, which had recently been visited by Hetman Platov, who had moved on after leaving a force of Cossacks there. At daybreak, Ermolov reached Maloyaroslavets, in front of which the viceroy's entire army was already gathered. Doktorov, encamped behind the town, entrusted Ermolov with the task of relieving Maloyaroslavets and reinforced him with his own infantry. Our forces were driven back from there twice, despite great displays of valor on the part of our officers. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Kutuzov had reached the village of Spasko, not far from Maloyaroslavets, with his entire army and told his men to rest. Ermolov sent General Count Orlov Denisov with an urgent plea for Kutuzov to hurry towards the town, but receiving no reply, he dispatched a German prince who was then with our army, with a renewed request for them to come as quickly as possible. The field marshal, resentful at this insistence, literally spat with rage. Then General Raevsky's corps began its march towards Maloyaroslavets, and soon the whole army began to follow him. Raevsky himself, as a mere spectator, remained for some time near the town to observe how the battle was going. Having once more been forced out of the town by superior forces, Ermolov had positioned 40 field pieces by the main gate and planned to confront the enemy with a heavy bombardment. Lacking sufficient troops, he had prepared to fall back in an orderly retreat. The arrival of the army, however, changed the situation entirely. It was Konovnitsyn who fearlessly drove the enemy out of the town. Kutuzov, having gained much experience in the war against the Turks, then devised a very strange solution for holding the enemy at bay in the event of renewed attack. He ordered several redoubts to be erected within firing distance of the town, but after a few shots from inside the town, the 1,500 workmen dropped their tools and scattered. Eventually, Maloyaroslavets was abandoned and reoccupied by enemy troops. After the initial battle, Kutuzov had a curious conversation with Ermolov, which I can only summarize here. The Prince: "My dear man, are we to march on?" Ermolov: "Of course, but only towards Medin." The Prince: "How can we move in plain view of the enemy?" Ermolov: "There is no danger at all. Hetman Platov captured several field pieces on the other side of the stream without encountering any resistance. After this battle, which has proved we are ready to repulse all enemy attacks, we have nothing to fear from them." When Kutuzov announced his intention to retreat from Maloyaroslavets, Ermolov tried to persuade him to stay for a few more hours, when the intentions of the enemy would become clearer. But the prince was adamant, and the army retreated. If Napoleon, having reached Borovsk, had made haste to hurl his entire force at Maloyaroslavets, he would have seized the town without any trouble. Having forestalled our army here, he would have been able to march to Ukhnov and from there continue his retreat through a part of the country that was fertile and not laid to waste. Fate dealt Ermolov the enviable opportunity of rendering the greatest service to his country, but this great exploit, distorted by historians, is known only to a few. At that moment, the partisan Prince Kudashev, stationed between Lopazny and Voronovo, started to pursue the enemy vanguard, which was attempting to screen the movement of the body of troops along the banks of the river Moka, attempting to link up with the rest of the French army. Any military man worth his salt can clearly see that the main body of their troops, shadowed by the units of Dorokov, Seslavin, Figner, and Kudashev, could not hope to take a single step in secrecy. Their salvation depended on bypassing our left flank without being detected, and showing up unexpectedly in Maloyaroslavets. Through there, Napoleon could have escaped the net drawn up around Tarutino, and opened an unimpeded passage towards the river Dnieper, and a country yet untouched by war. He could also have made a junction with Evers, Junot, and Victor, and might even have contemplated offensive action, his flanks and rear being completely free and unimpeded. If we move from effect to cause, it is evident that Seslavin's mission and information decided Russia's fate. Yet, to bring about this reversal of fortune, it still needed prompt action on the part of Ermolov and his willingness to assume full responsibility for turning Dokhturov's corps towards Maloyaroslavets, as well as the action of the commander-in-chief, who finally realized the strategic importance of this town and directed the whole army to move there 8 hours later. Not knowing anything about what had occurred in this area, on the evening of the 9th, we intercepted another courier not far from Fedorovsk and moved on to Spasko. When we arrived at that village, our patrols brought back several enemy soldiers who were busy looting nearby settlements. Since they were few in number, I turned them over to the village elder for eventual delivery to Ukhnov. As they were led past us, Beketov noted that one of these prisoners seemed to look more like a Russian than a Frenchman. We stopped him to ask what nation he belonged to, at which he fell on his knees and admitted that he was a former Russian grenadier and had been employed as a second lieutenant in the service of the French for the past 3 years. "What?" we exclaimed in horror. "You, a Russian, are spilling the blood of your brothers." "I'm guilty," he confessed. "Please take pity on me." I sent a few hussars to fetch all the villagers, young and old, and women with children from neighboring settlements, and had them brought to Spasko. When they assembled, I told my group and the villagers about the activities of this traitor and asked them to judge him. With one voice they said, "Guilty." Then I asked them what punishment they thought he deserved. A few said, "Whip him to death." About 10 others said, "Hang him." A few said, "The firing squad." In a word, all opted for the death penalty. I called for several riflemen and had him blindfolded. He only had time to say, "Lord, forgive my sin." The hussars fired, and the wretch fell dead. There was another strange case. A few hours after this execution, the peasants from neighboring villages brought me 6 French stragglers. This surprised me greatly because, until that time, they had never brought me any prisoners, always dealing with them on their own. These unfortunates, tied up with ropes and pulled down into a ditch, would not have escaped the fate of their predecessors had the noise of horsemen and the sound of Russian speech not announced our arrival. Killing them would have been useless, so they decided to bring their captives to me and have me decide their fate. I gave orders to include them among the prisoners already in our hands and to send them all to Ukhnov. From there, they would be conveyed to remote districts where they would probably either die on the way, become the victims of their corrupt guards, or be dealt with by indifferent civilian authorities. But how amazing are the decrees of divine providence! Among these prisoners was a drummer boy from the young guard by the name of Vincent Bode, a 15-year-old lad torn away from his family and transported 4,000 versts from home to face Russian steel and Russian frosts. Seeing him, my heart bled for him. I remembered my own family home and my father, who handed me over to military service when I was almost his age. How could I consign this lad to the uncertainties of a cold, hungry, and shelterless wandering, having the means at hand to save him? I took him aside, told my men to dress him in a Cossack coat and hat so that he would come to no unforeseen bodily harm. And in this way, through successes and failures, over hills and valleys, from country to country, I carried him on horseback all the way to Paris, in good health, full of optimism, almost grown up, and delivered him personally to the waiting arms of his elderly father. What happened next? 2 days later, both father and son came to me and asked me for an affidavit. With great pleasure, I told them. Here, Vincent, is a paper attesting to your good conduct. No, replied the father. You saved my son. Please complete your good deed and give him a document to certify that he was with you and was defeating the enemy. But the enemy was your countryman. Doesn't matter, protested the old man. What do you mean? You'll only condemn your son. They'll drag him before a firing squad for sure. Times are different now, answered the old man. Thanks to this certificate, he'll wipe out the record of his unwilling service to the usurper of the throne, and will receive a reward for having fought against those who served in the ranks of those opposed to the legitimate monarch. If that's so, then may the Lord have pity on your poor France, I exclaimed. Here's the attestation that you insist on. And truly, I lied in that document and invented things just like those who write about victory in a battle they never took part in. But the old man was right. In a week's time, he came again to see me with his son to thank me for his new promotion. Vincent was already sporting in his lapel the Order of the Fleur de Lis. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.